Alrighty, so 3-2, conditionals and their related statements. We learned that conditionals or if-then statements have a hypothesis and conclusion, and they can be written using the following notation. We say P arrow Q, or we say P implies Q, or if P, then Q. Sometimes we talk about the opposite meaning of the statement called the negation of the statement. This is how we write the notation for the negation. Basically, you're saying, okay, if you have P and you want to negate P or your hypothesis, you will say not P. This is the meaning right here. So the meaning would be not P. Okay, and this is the symbol that we use. It's a squiggly line or the tilde. Okay, so for example, here's a statement: it is going to rain today. And if I were to negate this statement, I will say it is not going to rain today. So essentially, the negation turns the meaning of a statement the opposite. Okay, let's go ahead and do some more examples. So, number 1, write the negation for the following statements. The sky is cloudy today. So for me to negate that statement, I would say the sky is not cloudy today. Okay? Now, I just want to go ahead and emphasize this. The negation does not mean it will turn into something and the sentence will include the word not. If I were to say, like, let's say I forget number 1 and this was the question, how do I negate the statement? The sky is not cloudy today. Well, all I have to do is to negate the statement, get rid of the word not and say the sky is cloudy today. Okay? So I just want to make sure that we're all clear about that. Now, let's go ahead and take a look at number 2. Triangles have 3 angles. To negate that, I would say triangles do not have 3 angles. Okay? So, some statements are based on a given statement. These are called related statements. So here we've talked about the conditional statement, which is in the form if P, then Q. But now I'm going to go ahead and introduce you to the converse, inverse, and contrapositive. The converse is the statement formed by exchanging the hypothesis and conclusion. So basically that means that here's my P, then Q. The converse of that would be if Q, then P. Okay? The inverse is the statement formed negating the hypothesis and the conclusion. So I'm negating P and also Q. So that would be not P, then not Q. Okay? Not P, then not Q. Okay? The contrapositive is a statement formed by both exchanging and negating the hypothesis and conclusion. So I'm going to exchange. Watch this. So here's my original form. I'm going to exchange it and say Q, then P, but I got to negate it. So I'm going to say not Q, not P. So that's the contrapositive. So please make sure that you have all this memorized. So what's the conditional? What's the converse? What's the inverse? What's the contrapositive? You should be able to differentiate these forms. Okay. Write the converse, inverse, and contrapositive of each statement. If you live in Austin, then you live in Texas. Is that true? Is that false? And if it's false, provide a counterexample. So, if you live in Austin, then you live in Texas. And if we recall from that little diagram we saw in 3-1, well, what's outside? Texas, right? And then what's inside? It's Austin. So I like to think of this outer circle as my container, or, this is the state of Texas and it contains all the cities, right? Like Austin, Dallas, San Antonio, etc., etc. So if you live in Austin, right, does that imply that you live in Texas? Yes, it does. So that's true. The converse. The converse, by the way, is in the form if Q, then P, right? Here, let me go ahead. I should have done this at the beginning. Right here, this is my P, and this right here is my Q. The converse would be if Q, then P. So let me go ahead and write that. If you live in Texas, then you live in Austin. Okay? Now, let's go ahead and take a look at this sentence right here. If you live in Texas, then you live in Austin. So if you live in Texas, does it mean that you strictly live in Austin? No. That's false, because you could live in Houston. Right? And this is how I want you to think about it. When you're writing your counterexample, you first want to assume that the hypothesis is true. This is now your hypothesis. And then what comes right after that, is that true or is that false? So if you live in Texas, yes, Texas does exist, but does it mean that you live in Austin? No. So my counterexample here, so how I came up with this counterexample is I think of a city in Texas, but that's not Austin. Okay, so could live in Houston is a great, and this is a very, very specific counterexample. Okay. The next one is what we call the inverse, and the inverse is not P, then not Q. So not P, then not Q. So if I were to say, if you don't live in Austin, then you do not live in Texas. Okay? So if you don't live in Austin, then you don't live in Texas. So if you live anywhere but Austin, does it imply that you don't live in Texas? No. So my counterexample would be, could live in San Antonio. Okay, this place is not Austin, and but this place is still in Texas. So this is a great counterexample, and again, I'm being very, very, very specific. Okay. Lastly, the contrapositive. So the contrapositive would be not Q, then not P. And this is the statement I am going to use. So you would say for the contrapositive, not Q, not P. So if you do not, but I accidentally wrote it over here. If you do not live in Texas, then you do not live in Austin. Okay, let's think about this logically. If you do not live in Texas, then obviously you do not live in Austin, right? So this is a true statement. And now what I want you to go ahead and do is I want you to look at this. Oh, I should write false here. Okay, so now what I want you to go ahead and do is I want you to look at the truth value. So notice that we have a conditional that's true and a contrapositive that's true. So the conditional and contrapositive will always have the same truth value. Right? So here and here, they are true. And then you can see that the converse and the inverse are also the same. Okay? Now, one misconception about the truth values being the same is that Yes, they are the same. So the conditional and contrapositive are the same, and the converse and the inverse are the same. But I do want to make sure that you understand this. If any case the conditional is false, which can happen, that means that the contrapositive will be false, right? See how the conditional is true here and the contrapositive is true here? Yes, you're on the right page. So if you were to say that the conditional is false, then the contrapositive will also be false, all right? And that's the same thing for the converse and the inverse. So if the converse were to be true, then the inverse will also be true. Okay, but in this case, for this situation, for this specific example, this is false, this is false, this is true, this is true. Okay, all right, let's go ahead and take a look at number 2. If an angle measures 30 degrees, then it is acute. Is that true? Yes, it is true. Okay, so we have to assume that the hypothesis is true, and then what does it imply? It's acute. So it's true. Now the converse would be if Q, then P. Okay. To write that, I would say if an angle is acute, then its measure is 30 degrees. So if an angle is acute, does it strictly mean that it's 30 degrees? I'm going to say false on this one. So we can assume that an angle can be acute. That is absolutely true. There does exist an angle that is acute. But does it imply that the measure is 30 degrees? I'm going to say no for this one because I'm thinking of a counterexample. And I'm going to say 25 degrees because that's acute, right? If an angle is acute, it can be 25 degrees, 30 degrees, 45 degrees, or 60. And so on and so forth, but it has to be less than 90 degrees, right? And this is a very, very specific counterexample for that. Okay, now the inverse is this. It'd be not P, then not Q. Okay, and I would say if an angle does not measure 30 degrees, then it's not acute. So if an angle is something that doesn't measure 30 degrees, does it imply that it's not acute? Well, I'm thinking of a number that isn't 30, like 25 again, but it's acute, right? So this basically is my counterexample to that. So 25 degrees is a great counterexample to that. So this is false. And lastly, the contrapositive would be not Q, then not P. So if an angle is not acute, then its measure is not 30 degrees. So if an angle is not acute, does it obviously mean it's not 30? Yes, that is true.